Have you ever noticed someone insisting on living inside your head, even when you don't want them to? You wake up, try to distract yourself, but that person returns like a shadow stuck in your thoughts. It doesn't matter if they're gone, if they're not around, or if they were never truly part of your life. Their presence is so strong, it can suffocate you. And the most disturbing thing, it's not love, it's not simple longing, it's not destiny. Carl Jung revealed that when someone becomes a mental obsession, what's happening isn't about the other person, but about you. It's your mind, your unconscious, projecting archetypes, wounds, expectations, and even old traumas onto an external face. It's your shadow asking to be seen. But why this particular person? Why does she seem to suffocate your mind even when she's absent? And most importantly, how can you break free from this seemingly endless cycle? The answer is harsh, but liberating, and only those who understand this will be able to stop being held hostage by thoughts that steal your peace. There's a silent phenomenon that permeates the human mind, the constant presence of someone who isn't physically present, but insists on occupying space within us. Who hasn't found themselves thinking, almost involuntarily, of a person who seems to have left an invisible mark? It's not just a memory, but something deeper, touching on hidden aspects of the ego and persona. Carl Jung said that the psyche is not simple. It's a stage where archetypes enact dramas unknown to us, and we are often merely spectators of what our own soul enacts. Modern spirituality calls this energetic connection, but in analytical psychology, the phenomenon takes on the contours of shadow work, a shadow demanding recognition. This scenario is not uncommon. It could be someone we love, someone we reject, even someone who has hurt us. The curious thing is that even unintentionally, this figure returns again and again, like an echo within us. And the more we try to expel them from our minds, the more they seem to find ways to remain. What's most intriguing is the feeling of suffocation. The mind creates images, dialogues, hypotheses, as if the real absence didn't matter, because on the psychic plane, the presence is undeniable. The person thinks, why can't I stop remembering him, her? And then the doubt arises. Whether this is love, dependence, or simply a trick played by the unconscious. The ego tries to rationalize. It must be because it was special, because something was left unfinished. Meanwhile, the persona, always concerned with social image, feigns indifference while inside the storm continues. Carl Jung would point out that this is the call of the unconscious, showing that it is not the other itself, but what the other awakens in us. When spirituality speaks of mirrors of the soul, it touches on this same wound, that the other is less a visitor to our mind and more a reflection of parts of ourselves not yet integrated. This phenomenon is not trivial, nor should it be treated with disregard. It signals something greater, almost like an internal summons to look within. After all, if it were merely a memory, it would have come and gone. But no, it remains, insists, suffocates. This opens the field of shadow work, because the shadow is what we reject or fail to recognize within ourselves, and the unconscious finds a face in the other to project this content. The archetype involved can vary. Sometimes it's the figure of the lover, other times it's the guide, the enemy, even the fallen hero. Whatever it is, it doesn't appear by chance. Spirituality suggests that these obsessions may be ties from past lives, but even without resorting to mystical explanations, Jungian psychology offers a clear map. There's something within us that demands integration, and the more we ignore it, the more suffocated we become. And this leads us to an inevitable question. Why do certain people seem to have the power to mentally suffocate us even when they're far away? It's strange, almost uncomfortable, how someone who isn't in the room still manages to occupy every corner of our thoughts. It's as if the mind creates a parallel presence, one that walks alongside us, even when we try to escape. Carl Jung would explain this as the power of the collective unconscious and the archetypes that manifest without asking permission. When someone stirs something deep within the ego or persona, that mark doesn't disappear with physical absence, because it's not the body that remains, but the symbol that person has come to represent. Spirituality would call it an energetic bond, but in practice, it's as if the unconscious has found a perfect canvas to project what was hidden. The curious thing is that fixation doesn't depend on how long we've lived together or the intensity of the relationship. Sometimes, even a brief encounter is enough to leave this psychic scar. The reason this person seems suffocating is linked to the way our psyche works with gaps. Where there's a void, the brain creates images, dialogues, and scenarios that fuel the absence. It's like watching a never-ending movie in which every detail is replayed countless times. The ego in this game tries to take control, justifying things like, it must be fate, maybe it's true love, while the persona feigns balance, displaying indifference to the outside world. But inside, the story is different. The person feels dominated by the other's invisible presence. Jung would point out that this is the unconscious's way of saying, there's something here you need to look at. And when we don't look, the presence grows, suffocates, repeats itself, because it's not the other that's imprisoning us. It's ourselves. Many, in an attempt to understand, turn to spirituality, believing it's about soul connections, bonds from past lives, or even karma that comes back to collect. These narratives are powerful, and in a way, they bring relief. After all, if there's a mystical explanation, it's not just our fault. But analytical psychology is even more provocative because it takes us out of our comfort zone. It's not about destiny, it's about what's inside us and what we refuse to see. The other becomes a mirror, and the mirror is disturbing. Perhaps this person symbolizes the archetype of the rejected lover, the absent mother figure, or the idealized hero who never existed. It doesn't matter. The point is that by holding this symbol within our minds, the unconscious is asking us to stop living only in the external and begin exploring the internal territory where the real story unfolds. And this path leads us directly to Carl Jung's perspective on the phenomenon. In Carl Jung's view, nothing that happens in the mind is accidental. When someone remains fixed in our thoughts, even against our will, this is not just a whim of the ego, but a profound movement of the unconscious. Jung believed that every human encounter activates archetypes, primordial images that shape the way we feel, think, and act. Thus, when a person becomes a kind of psychic ghost, they cease to be just themselves and begin to represent something much greater, a symbol. This symbol can carry the shadow, the persona we hide, or even the self we seek. This is why spirituality speaks so much of mirrors. It's not exactly about the other, but about what the other awakens. Jung would also remind us that the psyche likes to use the other as a projection screen. It's as if the unconscious were saying, here's a part of you that you don't yet recognize. The subject that becomes a mental obsession may carry traits we lack, repressed desires, or even never-healed emotional wounds. The ego tries to fight this because accepting it is painful. The persona, in turn, dons the mask of rationality. It doesn't make sense to think so much about someone, but the unconscious doesn't follow linear logic. It operates with images, symbols, and emotions, and this is where spirituality and analytical psychology meet. Both recognize that there are invisible forces shaping the way we relate to and fixate on certain people. This Jungian perspective changes the way we interpret someone's insistent presence in our thoughts. It's not just longing or desire, but a calling. It could be the lover archetype awakening our sensitivity, the shadow demanding recognition, or even an archetypal memory of abandonment, activating still living childhood wounds. The fascinating thing is that for Jung, the unconscious is never wrong. It always presents us with the exact image we need to evolve. Thus, each person who becomes stuck in our mind is not an accident, but an opportunity. An opportunity to delve deeper into shadow work, to dialogue with the unconscious, and to discover that ultimately the other is merely the password to access hidden layers of ourselves. And this opens the way for an even bolder interpretation. What really makes someone become a mental obsession? What transforms someone into a mental obsession isn't their physical presence, but the symbolic impact that person exerts within the psyche. Carl Jung would show that when someone touches our wounds or awakens something dormant, the unconscious grasps that image and doesn't easily let go. The ego may even want to move on, but the unconscious continues replaying scenes, creating dialogues, reenacting moments. It's almost like an internal film that never ends. Spirituality would call this an energetic bond, but in the language of analytical psychology, it's an intense projection of archetypes. The idealized lover, the unreached guide, the inner enemy. The person who becomes a mental obsession is less about themselves and more about what they represent to those who carry them in their thoughts. This obsession is fueled by a psychological cycle. First, there's an internal emotional void, an emptiness that demands filling. When someone appears and touches this point, the mind immediately creates a narrative, as if that encounter were the missing piece in life's puzzle. The ego tries to justify it. This person is special. They're unique. The persona, on the other hand, creates the social mask, feigning detachment while secretly feeding the mental addiction. And it's in this conflict that the thought repeats itself, like an almost compulsive need. Jung would point out that when we don't recognize our shadow, it finds external faces to manifest itself. In other words, it's not the other that captivates our mind, but the piece of ourselves we project onto them. A practical example of this can be seen in romantic relationships. Someone becomes involved with someone who seems perfect, but who in reality only reflects repressed characteristics. Who hasn't fallen in love with someone unapproachable, feeling that their obsession was almost magical? This is the unconscious projecting the lover archetype mixed with the shadow that demands recognition. And it's not just in love. Even a boss, a friend, or even a stranger can take on this role. Spirituality can interpret it as destiny, but analytical psychology is more pragmatic. This fixation is a message from the unconscious, telling us that there's something within us that needs to be worked on. And the more we resist, the more the thought intensifies. But after all, how does analytical psychology explain this in detail when applied to the topic? When delving into the concepts of analytical psychology, the explanation for this phenomenon begins to take shape. Carl Jung always emphasized that the psyche is driven by symbols, not logical facts. Thus, when a person becomes fixed in our minds, what remains is not the person themselves, but the symbol they represent within us. This symbol can be linked to the ego, which feels the need for completeness, to the persona, which wants to maintain a social image, or even to the shadow, which cries out for recognition. Spirituality sees this as an invisible link, while Jung saw it as inevitable unconscious projections. This insight helps us understand why someone who rationally shouldn't matter occupies so much space within us. They are no longer an individual, but an archetype in action. Among the central concepts of analytical psychology, one of the most powerful is projection. Projecting means attributing to another something that's within us, but which we can't see or accept. The subject that becomes a mental obsession often carries qualities or defects that belong to us. It's as if the unconscious takes repressed content and says, "Can't you see this in yourself? Then I'll show it on someone else's face." Shadow work becomes crucial here, because without this internal work, we tend to keep repeating fixation patterns. And every time we ignore it, the unconscious creates new characters to play the same role. Another crucial concept is that of archetypes. Jung said they are universal patterns of behavior and emotion. When someone obsessively occupies our minds, they are usually embodying an archetype that dominates us. It could be the nurturing mother archetype, which activates infantile needs, the hero archetype, which awakens a desire for salvation, or the lover archetype, which triggers repressed passions. These archetypes don't choose faces at random. They use people who somehow cross our path and touch our blind spots. That's why the phenomenon is so powerful. It's not just someone in your mind. It's an ancient, symbolic, almost mythical force that has found expression in a human face. And this leads us to consider the practical reasons why someone might be constantly in our thoughts. There are several reasons why a person remains trapped in our mental field. Carl Jung would say it's no coincidence, but the result of a dance between the conscious and unconscious. Often this constant presence stems from an internal void. When there's an emotional gap, the ego tries to fill it with someone else's image. The persona, concerned with maintaining a semblance of balance, may even pretend everything is fine, but the mind continues to bring up this figure as a solution to invisible discomfort. Spirituality describes them as energy loops that tangle in our soul, while analytical psychology interprets them as inevitable projections, archetypes taking up space within us. The mind, after all, cannot stand emptiness. It prefers to create imaginary dialogues, hypotheses and memories rather than face silence. Another reason is the emotional intensity experienced with that person, even in small doses. Have you ever noticed how sometimes a single gesture, a word or a look is enough to leave an indelible mark? This happens because the unconscious registers much more than the conscious perceives. That moment may have activated a powerful archetype. The lover, the protector, the guide, or even the enemy. This archetype, once awakened, insists on repeating its call. Spirituality speaks of soul connections, but Jung would say it's the shadow itself nudging us. There's something of yours here that you need to see. It doesn't matter if the relationship was long or brief, whether there was deep cohabitation or only superficial encounters. The symbolic impact is what truly determines the constant presence. There are also situations where mental attachment arises from unresolved unconscious needs. The mind, in its eagerness to close cycles, insists on revisiting unfinished stories, as if repeating memories were an attempt to find answers. This is why we often think of people who walked away without explanation, of unrequited loves, or even of conflicts that never resolved. The ego doesn't accept gaps, and the persona tries to mask the discomfort. But the unconscious is not fooled. It continues to bring the figure to the mental stage until the message is understood. And here arises the great provocation. Isn't it precisely in these internal emotional or psychological gaps that the root of this fixation lies? The people who remain trapped in our minds are often a direct reflection of our emotional voids. Carl Jung asserted that the unconscious cannot tolerate emptiness. Where there is an absence, it creates images, symbols, and fantasies to fill it. This is why, often, someone becomes an obsession, not for what they did, but for what they represented within us. The ego tries to explain this process by saying that the person is unique or irreplaceable. But in reality, what is happening is the activation of a lack that already existed long before the encounter. The persona in this game wears a mask of strength, but secretly feeds the cycle of thoughts. And spirituality doesn't let it go unnoticed. It calls this hunger of the soul, a profound call to look at the wounds we try to hide. These gaps can stem from past experiences, often even in childhood. When someone grows up feeling a lack of affection, validation, or belonging, they tend to project these needs onto those who appear later. It's as if the unconscious is saying, maybe now you'll find what you've always sought. But in practice, no one can occupy this internal space. Therefore, the person who takes on this role becomes a mental obsession. They're not just in our present, but also dialoguing with an unresolved past. Jung would point out that this is the perfect time for shadow work, to face head-on what the ego avoids. Practical examples: writing an emotional journal, revisiting memories honestly, or even seeking therapy to name these invisible gaps. In adulthood, these gaps manifest in repeated patterns. Those who feel a lack of attention may fixate on distant people, as if reliving abandonment. Those who have never received recognition may cling to the image of someone who offers small doses of validation. It's almost like an emotional economy. Where there's a lack, any crumb seems like an abundance. Spirituality speaks of karmic bonds, but analytical psychology reveals something even more revealing. We are trying to heal in the present pains that arose in the past. Thus, the person who becomes a mental obsession isn't just someone who takes up space in our minds. They're a cruel mirror of our own gaps. And if gaps already say so much, imagine the weight they gain when added to unresolved issues, such as feelings, traumas, and expectations. When we talk about people who linger in our thoughts, we cannot ignore the weight of unresolved issues. Carl Jung taught that everything that is not brought to consciousness returns as destiny. And what are obsessive thoughts if not destiny trying to get our attention? Often, it is not the person themselves that occupies space, but what remains pending: unexpressed feelings, unprocessed traumas, expectations that have not been fulfilled. The ego, in its attempt to control, insists on returning to the original scene, reenacting it countless times, as if it could change the outcome. The persona, in turn, tries to disguise it. It shows the world that it has overcome it, when in reality the unconscious continues to bring the figure to the internal stage. Spirituality interprets this process as open cycles, energies that continue to rotate until they are closed. These pending issues can be simple, like a conversation we missed, or complex, like deep traumas linked to abandonment, rejection, or emotional abuse. The unconscious doesn't differentiate intensity, it simply stores them. And when it encounters a face that symbolizes the wound, it activates the entire unresolved emotional repertoire. This is why we sometimes feel that person is the cause of the pain, when in fact they are merely the trigger. Jung would show that at this point we are facing the shadow, which insists on confronting us with what we avoid. Practical examples can help us understand. Someone who was never validated by their parents may fixate on those who give them small doses of attention. Someone who has suffered a loss may cling to those who trigger the same fear of abandonment. Another important aspect is expectations that never come true. How often do we project a future, a story, a possibility onto another? When this doesn't happen, the unconscious doesn't accept it so easily. It keeps rewriting the script. What if it had worked out? What if she came back? The ego, desperate to close the narrative, creates 1,000 versions of what could have been. This ghost of what didn't happen is as powerful as the lived reality. Spirituality calls them untraveled lines of destiny. Analytical psychology points to them as projections that become psychic currents. And when these currents join emotional gaps, the most difficult mental obsession to break is born. But there is still an element that further deepens this process: unconscious projection, where we begin to see in the other something that, in truth, belongs only to us. Now you understand. That person who never left your mind was never about them. It was always about you. about your gaps, your wounds, your projections. It was your shadow using someone else's face to scream for attention. And I ask you, how long will you remain hostage to this ghost? How long will you allow unresolved thoughts to steal your peace, your nights of sleep, your vital energy? Would you rather remain trapped in what was never fulfilled, or finally look within and end this cycle? The truth is harsh but liberating. No one living in your head has more power than you give them. The time to cut that chain is now. Start your shadow work. Acknowledge your shadow. Love what you've rejected in yourself. Only then will you free yourself from others, and most importantly, from yourself. And if this video tore something apart inside you, if it opened your eyes to truths no one else has ever had the courage to tell you, then subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because here you'll find more than answers. You'll find the courage to never again live a prisoner of your own mind.